Hello there, all of you. So, it's the final day for this here display that I've put together. And I figured that before I get to tearing down, I would make a video walkthrough for posterity and sharing purposes. I know that not everybody who wanted to see this was able to make it down in the brief window we had allotted. Now, it's a little bit echoey in here, so I'm going to record the rest of the voiceover at home. I hope you find this interesting. Aquenya Unwe, Haudenosaunee clothing in the early contact period. Introduction. Hello there. In this exhibit we are going to take a look at historical Haudenosaunee and First Nations clothing, as well as some jewelry and decorations and the materials and construction of each. We will also look a little at how these changed through the early colonial period. I have attempted to illustrate these by creating numerous recreations modeled after artifacts, period illustrations, and written descriptions. This was a little bit difficult as there are only a few clothing artifacts from before 1800. There also aren't a ton of useful descriptions, and there are only a handful of decent illustrations from the 1600s and early 1700s. So in some places I have had to draw from neighboring and related cultures, particularly Huron-Wendat, in the assumption that fashion travels a little, an unfortunate necessity. So while the target of this exhibit is Haudenosaunee peoples, most of it will hold for Iroquoian peoples more broadly, and some of it applies to the eastern woodlands as a whole. Such is the nature of working with our history. This project is manifested into a couple of complete sets of clothing for both men and women from two eras. The four main mannequins are roughly modeled after the clothing of the early 1600s and then the mid-1700s, so as to show how fashion changed through the influence of the fur trade and the introduction of new materials and new economic incentives. I have attempted to create sort of middle quality clothing, not fancy, highly decorated pieces, but not rough, mucking about clothing either. I'm aiming for semi-nice stuff that an average person like you might wear in your day-to-day. Additional display cases show some jewelry, tools, and other bits and pieces that wanted to be talked about independently. Two additional mannequins show winter clothing and a suit of pre-contact wooden armor. Finally, here and there on the walls I've put up some additional pictures showing historical illustrations, photos of artifacts, and some extra plaques about the research process and some of the difficulties. I think clothing is a good angle for learning about the past in more practical terms. When you study history by reading of kings and battles and the perennial exploitation of the masses, it can all sound very abstract and alien, if not outright boring. But it isn't all that difficult to imagine yourself in a different set of clothes. That's a part of my love of experimental archaeology. When you pick up a needle and thread, you put yourselves in the shoes of those who came before. When you try to make a historical reproduction, you have to think about your materials in a similar way to those who came before. And when you try those objects out, you get to experience a little bit of what came before. I don't claim to be an authority on this subject, so there's bound to be at least a couple of mistakes. I apologize. The main objective of this exhibit is just to spark a bit of curiosity about First Nations history. I hope you found this exhibit interesting. Malcolm Gayohago Paulus Lines. A brief word on terminology. I was reminded that not everyone here is going to be familiar with some of the names I use in the text of this exhibit, so here's a quick primer. The main focus of this exhibit is Haudenosaunee, which is a confederacy of 6 culturally and linguistically related First Nations. These are as follows: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. The Haudenosaunee are commonly referred to as Iroquois, which is the French name for us. The English name is the Six Nations. We originally came from the south side of Lake Ontario, but resettled along the Grand River in the late 1700s after the Americans stole our land, which is a story beyond the scope of this exhibit. Six Nations of the Grand River is the nearest reserve to Dundas. It's the largest and most populous reserve in Canada, and is home to members of all 6 Haudenosaunee nations. It's where my family is from. Haudenosaunee is the more polite term, but Iroquois is still in common use, particularly in academia. 2 related terms are derived from Iroquois. Iroquoian is an anthropological linguistic term referring to a broader group of culturally and linguistically related peoples. The Wendat are a prime example. They originally lived in the region north of Lake Ontario. They are not Haudenosaunee Iroquois, but they are Iroquoian. with a similar society, similar material culture, and similar language. Sort of like how English is classified as a Germanic language, but it doesn't mean that English are Germans, just that there are certain commonalities that are useful to academics. So broadly in this exhibit, I use the term Haudenosaunee when I want to refer to Six Nations folks specifically, while I use Iroquoian when I want to include people like the Wendat. Iroquoia is another anthropological historical term. It refers to the traditional homeland of most Iroquoian peoples. To simplify, we can think of this as the area surrounding Lake Ontario. The people who originally inhabited the west side of Lake Ontario, including the Dundas area, are called the Neutral Iroquoians, which is an unfortunate naming necessity as their proper name hasn't survived. Not much was written about them before they were weakened by disease and war and absorbed by the Seneca, but that's another story beyond the scope of this exhibit. They were also part of the Iroquoian family and fairly closely related linguistically and culturally, so the 1600s recreations might be broadly representative of what people around here might have worn before contact. Woman's clothing, 1600s. This mannequin is dressed in the following from the ground up. Moccasins. These are a simple pair of pucker-toe moccasins. They are made from modern deerskin. Leggings. These are a pair of knee-length leggings made from lightly smoked leather, held up with a pair of braided leather garters. Skirt. This is a simple wraparound skirt made from several pieces of leather. Typically these were made from only 2 panels, but the skins I had available were a little too short, so I added on an extension to the hem which gave it this double fringe. The skirt is held up by a thin belt. Tunic. This tunic is an unusual asymmetrical design. It is a sleeveless tunic with a single affixed shoulder strap and a second detachable one, allowing you to adjust for temperature. The tunic is girded with a braided leather belt for suspending pouches, tools, and to give it a bit of a waist. Sleeves. These sleeves are a fairly simple design, but they're unusual in that they're also removable. They are connected by a cord across the back and put on under the tunic. Mantle. The mantle is used to close the gap at the neck of the dress and to give a bit of minor protection from rain or snow. The shoulder tunic. One style of dress that may have been worn throughout the eastern woodlands was what I am going to term the shoulder tunic, as I don't think it has a proper name. The first example is from paintings by John White of the indigenous people of what is now Virginia, and the woodcut copies by Theodore de Bry. Examples of the former seen on the bottom right. Another artistic example, closer to our region, comes from illustrations by Samuel de Champlain, this time in reference to the Montagnais, Innu of Quebec, bottom left. The only illustration I could find in reference to the Haudenosaunee are Joseph-Francois Lafitaux's illustration, bottom middle, which is clearly inspired by John White's or one of its copies, making things suspicious. But Lafitau in his text occasionally points out errors that the engravers made, so maybe it was close enough to reality for him to not complain about. Regardless of Lafitau and his unreliability, we know it was used south of Iroquois from White and that it was used north of Iroquois from Champlain, so I think it's plausible that it was used in between those two as well. Regardless of whether or not I'm correct, I made a recreation for this exhibit, mainly because it's different and interesting. The dress is sleeveless and asymmetrical. Only the one shoulder strap is permanently affixed. It was used by both men and women, maybe with stylistic variation, maybe not. In White's illustration, there is something that looks like a removable strap for the uncovered shoulder. That would be a handy inclusion, making the dress more versatile. Making the dress with only a single shoulder strap causes the hem to hang asymmetrically. I think this intentional asymmetry complements the natural individuality of leather. Irregularity is a lot more aesthetically pleasing if it looks like it was done intentionally. You play a sour note on the piano and it's a mistake, but play it a couple more times and it's jazz. The dress seems to my mind very practical. It's quite easy to pattern for, makes good use of irregular material. It would leave one arm completely unhindered for work. The large neck opening would also make it easier to put on even if you gain some weight. And as shown in Champlain's illustration, the dress might also be convenient for nursing. Overall, it fits in well with my broader theme of versatility and modularity. On sleeves, mantles, and modular clothing. My impression is that in the early/pre-contact era, the standard shirt, dress, tunic seems to have often been sleeveless, with the sleeves as a separate garment that could be worn as the weather demanded. These sleeves were tied together with a set of cords across the back and sometimes additionally supported with bracelets and sleeve garters. Attached sleeves seem to have only been common on winter coats. All of this ties into a broader point about versatility. A lot of the clothing in the period seems to have been designed to be highly modular, so that one can adjust the outfit for a variety of weather conditions without replacing the garment as a whole, allowing you to get more use and flexibility out of a smaller wardrobe. For example, rather than having a short-sleeved dress and a long-sleeved dress, each of which is only useful half the year, it's more efficient to have a pair of sleeveless dresses and some separate sleeves that can be included or excluded as the need arises. That way, you always have options. The mantle follows a similar principle. If it's hot out, you can forgo the mantle and have the shoulders exposed, or else put it on if it's cold and damp without having to get a completely different dress. Sure, it could be sewn onto the dress as a double layer around the shoulders, but you've got more options if you keep the garments separate. We see something similar with men's leggings, how the height of the upper cuff could be adjusted by tying it differently based on temperature. This modularity of the clothing would also give you versatility for changing weather. Chilly in the morning, so you go out with all the components, but you can take some of them off when the sun comes out. Another angle that occurs to me is that this pattern of modularity might also help in accommodating changes in body size. It's important to emphasize that clothing took a lot of effort back in the day. Using the standard Indigenous method of hide tanning, a deerskin takes about 10 hours of hard labor to turn into leather. That's if you're competent. Plus about a week of waiting while the skin soaks in lye or tanning solution. It takes about 7 deerskins to make a full set of clothing, so about 70 hours of work. And that's without counting the additional time needed to hunt and butcher the deer or the time spent on sewing. Economics obviously functioned very differently back in the day, but if we value this labor at modern minimum wage, this is the equivalent of paying almost $1,300 just for the materials for a set of clothes. And this is pretty good by historical standards. Spun and woven cloth could easily take twice as long per square foot of material, setting aside farming and sewing time. As was typical for eras when clothes were handmade, most people wouldn't own very many sets of clothes, probably just 2 or 3 sets of everyday clothes, as well as maybe a set of dress clothes and a couple of things for winter. So this modularity seems to me a very handy solution, allowing you to make the most of your clothes regardless of changing circumstance. Men's clothing, 1600s. The bulk of the leather for this mannequin's clothing was homemade using the traditional method of brain tanning. I'm not very good at tanning hides, so the quality is a little rough here. As before, clothing is described from the ground up. Moccasins. These are virtually the same as the women's moccasins, but made from homemade leather. These have a vamp in the center to make up for the starting pieces being a little small. Leggings. These are hip-length leggings. They are tied to a double leather belt at the waist and are also fastened with a simple leather garter below the knee. The pattern here is wrong, but I had to improvise due to material limitations. Breechcloth. This is made from deerskin and is looped over the same belt the leggings are tied to. Tunic. A simple sleeveless leather tunic. It has a more simple design than the one on the woman's side, being loosely based on an illustration from Lafitau. In reality, I think either design could be worn by men or women with only minor changes. I've elected to make them different just for variety. It is girded with a leather belt for carrying things. Sleeves. A pair of removable leather sleeves tied with a cord across the back, very similar to the women's side. Cloak. A simple leather cloak with some laces to tie at the neck. On fringes. A characteristic feature of First Nations clothing is the fringes that are cut into the hems and sewn at the seams of leather garments. It is said that these fringes are to help the garments shed water and to help with drying, wicking moisture to the fringe which dries faster due to greater surface area. Another cited use was as a method of sewing. Rather than sewing a seam with a single continuous thread, you could use many short threads, 1 per stitch, and just have the loose ends hanging. Whether or not either of those are true, I think the more important purpose, both then and now, is aesthetic. The fringe is, to my mind, a good way of disguising an uneven hem. It's a good way of interrupting an otherwise plain stretch of material. It's a good way of using leftover material that you would have had to just cut off otherwise. It's a good way of incorporating those scraps left over from previous projects that are too small to make anything useful out of. It's just a way of finishing a hem so that it looks nicer than a raw edge. On clothing from out west, you occasionally see clothes with extremely long fringes. But here in the Great Lakes region, they were mostly fairly short, a couple of inches, the width of a palm or so. Presumably they can get tangled or snagged on things, and presumably the longer they are, the easier it is for tangling to occur. It's better to keep them short if your region has a lot of forests. On breechcloths. The breechcloth was sort of like the undergarment of the day. It's not a complicated construction, just a long, broad strip of material that passes between the legs and is looped over the belt, with enough material left over to serve as an apron for the sake of modesty. There is this modern conception of the breechcloth that it consists solely of two flaps with nothing in between, like Adam and Eve with their fig leaves. This is a silly idea. Such a garment would not be functional. Wardrobe malfunctions would be constant. Instead, think of it more like a pair of briefs with aprons to hide any impression of what's underneath. For men, the breechcloth would often be visible, and as such would often have broad, decorated aprons. For women, the breechcloth was under a skirt, so tended to have smaller aprons and to be undecorated. Sometimes the breechcloth would be made from 3 pieces of material sewn together so that the decorative aprons could be removed from the undergarment when it needed to be replaced. With the introduction of European trade cloth, the breechcloth changed. They quickly started to be made almost exclusively from fabric rather than leather, probably due to cloth being easier to clean. Maybe they were also a little more comfortable. Some started to be made with the inner of cotton or linen, with the aprons remaining in leather or coarse wool. In the latter half of the 1800s, people stopped wearing leggings in favor of European-styled trousers. This made the breechcloth redundant, but some people wanted to retain the aesthetic, so the breechcloth again changed. The inner portion was discarded and the garment became 2 disconnected aprons worn over a pair of trousers. This garment remains in modern regalia. Woman's clothing, 1700s. As before, this mannequin is dressed in the following, from the ground up. Moccasins. These are a pair of pucker-toe moccasins. They use the same pattern as on the other mannequin. The pattern didn't really change until the 1900s. Leggings. These are a pair of knee-length woolen leggings. They are made with a similar pattern to the 1600s ones, but are slightly less form-fitting. Heavy woven cloth doesn't stretch as much as leather. They have a bit of simple embroidery around the seam and the cuff. They are tied with a pair of colorful woven garters. Skirt. This is a simple wraparound skirt made from wool. The pattern is simpler than the 1600s example. It's just a bolt of cloth wrapped 1.5 around with a tiny bit of cinching at the waist. It's held up by a leather belt which does most of the work in shaping the garment. Tunic. The tunic is simply a men's trade shirt. If the sleeves were too long, they could be hemmed or adjusted with garters to a more suitable length. It's belted with an arrow sash. Blanket cloak. A simple blanket of heavy wool. It could be worn in a variety of ways depending on conditions. On skirts. The skirts are of a fairly simple pattern, essentially a long broad piece of material that hangs around the waist and overlaps a bit, being held up by a belt. The hem of skirts typically hung at somewhere between the knee and mid-shin, to avoid getting in the way or dragging on the ground and getting dirty. Leather skirts were made of 2 panels, front and back. Each of these were tailored to be broader at the hem than at the waist, largely based on the natural irregularity of leather. One side is inevitably wider than the other. One half of the skirt was left unstitched. This is for practical purposes. It means that the skirt doesn't compromise your range of movement all that much. You can still run and jump and do all the stuff of life in one of these. It also makes the size of the skirt a lot more adjustable in terms of waist measurement. These will fit a 34-inch waist just as well as a 24-inch waist. You just change how much overlap there is at the unstitched side. Cloth skirts were of a simpler pattern, basically just a bolt of cloth. The only real shaping is done in the hemming. The lower edge is hemmed with a loose stitch, while the waistband is hemmed with a fairly tight stitch, making the skirt slightly narrower at the top. This pattern relies very heavily on the unstitched edge to allow for movement. Because of the lack of shaping, it would be very restrictive if it were sewn all the way down. During our period of interest, these were typically made out of trade blankets. On trade blankets. A common trade good was woolen blankets. This makes a lot of sense. The first ships might not be well equipped for trade, but they are already going to have blankets for the crew, which end up getting sold once they run out of other things to trade for furs. Wool blankets were valued by Indigenous people, as blankets obviously, but quite often they were also purchased with intention of cutting them up to make clothing. This was due to a couple of factors, mainly nonsense economics that make a blanket less valuable than the raw material it's made from. Anyone who's ever tried to sew their own clothes should already know about nonsense economics. How is it that it costs $40 to buy enough cloth to make a t-shirt, but I can buy a 20-pack of tees from Costco for $1.95? Besides nonsense, a blanket is also just a convenient unit of cloth. Easier to sell someone a blanket, this distinct, complete, useful object, rather than an abstract amount of cloth, and easier on the vendor because you don't have to measure and cut. So a lot of leggings and skirts and overcoats ended up being made from trade blankets. It's not really relevant to our period, but in northern Ontario and westward you can sometimes find illustrations of native people wearing homemade wool coats, and you can say, "Oh, I know the specific model of Hudson Bay Company blanket that coat was made from." The blanket was also used as an article of clothing. A blanket can be turned into a cloak simply by pinning it at the neck with a brooch or sewing in a couple of ties. There are also a variety of ways you can wear a blanket coat. It can be worn like a cape or tied with a belt, such that it acts like a makeshift coat. When not needed, the blanket coat can simply be folded up, thrown over the shoulder, maybe tied at the waist a bit like a sash or a tartan, or sometimes it was tied at the waist like a kilt. Left, Joseph Brant with the blanket over the shoulder. Right, a woman wearing the blanket like a cape and a man wearing it as a kilt. Below, some hunters wearing it with the hem belted as a makeshift coat. Men's clothing, 1700s. You should know the drill by now. This outfit is once again and always described from the ground up. Moccasins. These are a pair of pucker-toe moccasins, same pattern as the woman's side, but this time made from modern tanned buffalo skin, little less soft, little harder wearing. Leggings. These are hip-length leggings made from wool felt. They have a simple bit of embroidery around the seam and the cuff. They are held up by cords tied to a belt at the waist and by a pair of finger-woven garters below the knee. Breechcloth. The breechcloth is changed to one of cotton. The design is simplified a bit into a simple rectangle. The cloth is more flexible and doesn't need the additional shaping. Tunic. It is a simple trade shirt of the sort that was becoming ubiquitous in all regions exposed to European trade, identical in all meaningful ways to the one worn by the female mannequin. It is cinched at the waist with an arrow sash. Vest. This is a leather waistcoat. It is an example of combining European and Indigenous fashion. This waistcoat has a mantle incorporated into the design, reminiscent of the earlier era. On leggings. Indigenous leggings were quite a bit different from the modern use of the word. Abandon all association you have with the word. Think of them instead as a pair of disconnected pant legs. Women's leggings start at the foot and only extended to the knee, being held up by garters tied above the calf. For warmth and to protect against weeds, they didn't need to go higher, as the skirts covered the thigh. Men's leggings extended to the hip and were held up by strings which were then tied to a belt. They could also be tied above the calf with a garter, which made them a little more comfortable. This arrangement also made them adjustable depending on the temperature. The top strings could be tied at different lengths to show more or less thigh. Or else they could be undone entirely and rolled down over the garter, acting like a pair of reverse shorts or musketeer boots. Sometimes the ties could act like a drawstring around the upper cuff, closing it off and preventing debris from falling down the legging. In the olden days, these would be made of leather. After the fur trade got established, woolen leggings became more common, though leather leggings didn't go away entirely until the 1800s. Wool is warmer and easier to clean, but leather is tough, holds up better to kneeling, and is good at stopping wind. The standard style of leggings are made with the seam on the outside of the leg. The decoration and trimming could vary, but pretty much everyone used this basic design. A Haudenosaunee-specific design had the seam at the front of the leg, with the bottom part of the seam left unstitched such that it creates an opening around the foot. This allows for a nicer seal around the ankle when you tuck the leggings into the moccasins or vice versa. The drawback is a slightly less efficient use of material. It's unclear to me how universal this design was among Six Nations people. You can find plenty of illustrations of Haudenosaunee people wearing side seam leggings up until the early 1800s. Yet another tangent. Leggings seem to me an odd historical development. My mind sees trousers as a direct upgrade, and is it really that great a leap of ingenuity to go from leggings to full trousers? But clearly people saw some value in them since they stuck around so long. Even the rural French-Canadian population made extensive use of them. They chose them over pants. In the Roman days, the Germanic people used trousers. Then in the Middle Ages they switched over to leggings, most bizarre. Clearly there must be some significant advantage that I'm too prejudiced by modernity to think of. Temperature versatility, ease of manufacture, comfort, flexibility, aesthetics, you tell me. On trade shirts. The trade shirt was one of the first pieces of truly global fashion. It evolved from undertunics in medieval Europe and over time became a standalone sort of work shirt. The first Europeans in Canada were whalers and fishermen, and as such they weren't always equipped for trade. So, to acquire furs, they would sell spare tools, weapons, knickknacks, and in some cases the shirts off their backs. Indigenous people, from this first exposure, came to associate this pattern of sailor shirt with what European shirts are supposed to look like, and so, even in later periods would seek out shirts reminiscent of these, and the traders obliged and contracted factories to make shirts like this specifically for selling to Indians. It became the trade shirt. There was a bit of variety around the collar, but the broad pattern of all trade shirts was more or less the same. A similar pattern of adoption occurred in all regions of the world touched by European maritime trade, each region adopting the shirt and modifying it in their own ways. Shirts like this were used all across the world. They were the first piece of mass-produced, cheap global fashion. In the early days of colonialism, the trade shirt was manufactured from linen. As time went by, the American colonies got established and started growing cheap cotton on their slave plantations, so cotton took over. The shirts themselves are very loose and billowy, with slightly comical puffy sleeves. They give good freedom of movement, and the loose fit and thin material are quite good in the heat. They don't stick to you much when you're sweaty, and they help keep you cool. A drawback to the billowy sleeves is that because of the extra material and extra weight, the sleeves can sometimes hang at an awkward angle, causing the shirt to catch and pull across the shoulders uncomfortably. Or, to put it simply, sometimes the puffy sleeves just get in the way. This was solved with the sleeve garter, a band of material fastened below the bicep to keep the sleeve in place. The trade shirt was used by both men and women. The pattern and sizing tended not to vary. They were sailor shirts, so tended to be sized for men. So on a woman, the hem would just hang down a little further. The original one-size-fits-all. The availability of linen/cotton shirts changed Indigenous sensibilities regarding modesty. A leather shirt can get uncomfortably sticky if it's 30 degrees out and sweaty and you got work to do. And so it was not at all uncommon for people to go shirtless in summer. The trade shirt altered that, probably with the help of increasing Christianization. By the mid-1700s, women were covered up in all seasons, and by the late 1700s, it was a bit of a faux pas for men to be bare-chested as well. Maybe sort of like, oh, you're shirtless. What are you, poor? Are you a bad hunter? After the fur trade died in Iroquois, the trade shirt lived on. People modeling their homemade shirts off the old design, often using colorful or floral patterned cloth and decorating with bright ribbons. The overall pattern has changed a little since then, but the evolution is evident. The trade shirt became the ribbon shirt, which lives on to this day. Finger weaving, the arrow sash, ceinture fléchée. Silk sashes were a standard element of Renaissance European fashion. Indigenous people adopted bits and pieces of European fashion as time wore on. The economics of the fur trade led to occasions of cultural syncretism. Leather took the role of cloth prior to contact, so most First Nations never had a need to develop very complicated looms for weaving. Rather, it was more useful to develop better techniques of braiding. European traders occasionally brought along string and yarn, but weren't equipped to teach people how to knit and weave. So, with wool yarn entering the market, Indigenous people had to figure things out on their own, and applied their skills at braiding to developing a technique called finger weaving, where narrow bolts of cloth with complex patterns can be made with minimal equipment. This finger weaving wasn't capable of generating broad cloth for clothing, but was very useful at creating things like belts, straps, and garters, and allows for a lot of decoration potential. It became a popular choice for emulating the sashes the Europeans wore. The rural French Canadians saw a lot of utility in finger weaving. It made them a little less dependent on the old country, so they adopted it wholesale, bringing French aesthetics to the patterns and creating their own ways of finger weaving. The term arrow sash refers to the sort of patterns that were popular in Quebec. The sashes and garters in this exhibit are modern mass-produced examples. The patterns are probably not a great representation of what would have been used here, but they should serve to give a decent enough impression. The sash itself is a very useful outdoors garment. It can hold a coat closed, you can tuck tools into it, clearly, but it can also be folded to act as pockets or done up tightly to reinforce the back when carrying heavy things. Some French trappers would use it like a hernia belt. If the sash was long enough, it could be used like a tumpline when needed. At worst, it could serve as a bandage in case of emergencies or a scarf if caught out suddenly in bad weather. Eventually the Métis people of Manitoba adopted the arrow sash as a symbol of their culture, using it as a metaphor for the blending of French Canadian and Indigenous. This has unfortunately led people to associate the sash with the Métis exclusively. This is not the case. Indigenous people and French Canadians used it too. Gustoweh. The Gustoweh is the Iroquoian type of feather headdress. These are worn by traditionalists at certain ceremonies, dances, and special events. Spelling can vary, making research mildly annoying. Gustoweh are made from a frame of steam-bent ashwood, which is then either wrapped in leather or has a leather cap sewn over it. It is then decorated with feathers, mainly turkey with some eagle feathers in significant places, and beads. Each of the Six Nations have their own way of making and decorating Gustoweh. I have heard it said that one of their functions is to make national identity easier to recognize at group events. The one in this exhibit is from the early 1900s. I think it's Seneca, but I don't have the best eye for this, and this one is slightly damaged. Apologies if I'm wrong and you know better. I believe that the Gustoweh evolved from the helmets that would have been worn back in the day. The frame at the center of the Gustoweh is reminiscent of the frames of other helmets, such as the wooden helmets of the Inca or the segmented metal helmets of Dark Age Anglo-Saxons or other Europeans. The Gustoweh is also often made from quite robust pieces of wood. Unnecessarily so, I feel, as thin wood is lighter and easier to bend. If it's just there to provide some structure for the feathers, it doesn't need much thickness. In my previous work trying to reconstruct Iroquoian armour, I made a number of wooden helmets, some with or without a Gustoweh frame at the core. I can say that they improved the protective qualities of the helmet dramatically. So, my theory is that when Champlain came with his muskets and people stopped using their armour, maybe helmets stuck around a little longer, like they did in Europe, and gradually over time lost most of their protective elements and became more decorative and less functional. On moccasins. Iroquoian moccasins are a little bit different from the style you might be familiar with. The style that remains in general use in modern Canada was originated by the Algonquin people, and is constructed where the shoes have a second oval-shaped piece of leather on top of the foot. This style became ubiquitous in the modern day because the early Canadiens learned how to make their moccasins from the Algonquins. They took their style, made it their own, and exported it. The Euro-Canadian market began to associate the Algonquin style with what moccasins are supposed to look like. So, native people, looking to sell moccasins, started emulating the style which sells the best. And with so many Algonquin-style moccasins around, they become the example pattern by which young Indigenous learn how to make moccasins, until eventually everyone forgets that they had their own style to begin with. So it goes. The Iroquoian style of moccasin is called pucker toe. With this mode of construction, the body of the shoe is made from a single piece of leather wrapped and gathered, puckered if you will, around the toe, a bit like a bag with a drawstring. The advantage of this style is that it's very easy to make without a pattern or tape measure. You just wrap the leather around the foot and mark where it overlaps. The disadvantage I find is that it's difficult to size for someone else's foot if you don't have that foot in front of you. Maybe that's another reason why the Algonquin style is more common, easier to standardize. There were two general types of moccasin in use at the time, short and tall. Short moccasins were the standard worn by both men and women with no significant difference beyond size. They cover just the foot by default, but they also have a cuff that can be unfolded and tied around the ankle in cooler weather, or when going through deep snow or tall weeds. Leather puttees or fur gaiters could also be used to tie up the cuffs and keep snow out. Tall moccasins extended just below the knee. They were commonly only worn by women, essentially combining the moccasins with the leggings that women typically wore. These two types were typically unlined, just a single layer of thick leather, though in colder months one might wear rabbit fur socks underneath. In winter, one might wear a dedicated set of winter moccasins made from deer furs. These would have a higher cuff than standard. Moccasins were generally made out of the thickest, toughest leather available. Moose was preferred, but if this wasn't available, people would use the skins of large buck deer, typically from over the spine where the leather is thickest. People also preferred leather that had been smoked a little too much during the tanning process. This would make the leather dark and less prone to staining, but the smoke also helps the leather to hold up to moisture better. Moccasins changed very little over the years. They remained the primary footwear of people on Six Nations up until recently, as European materials offered no real advantage over them until the popularization of rubber soles in the 1900s. They are one of the few pieces of Indigenous fashion to have entered Euro-Canadian culture more broadly. Besides their modern use as slippers, they were also widely used as primary footwear in rural Quebec until the mid-1800s, and they remain one of the few items of Indigenous fashion to have survived into the modern day in semi-regular use, as a testament to their good design. Tourist crafts. This hat and these moccasins are from the museum collection. They were made around 1900. Heavy raised beadwork like this is a specifically Haudenosaunee style in which strings of beads are layered over each other to create a three-dimensional image. Interestingly, while the beading is a Haudenosaunee technique, neither these moccasins nor the hat are cut in the Haudenosaunee style. The hat is a Scottish Glengarry, while the moccasins are in the standard commercial pattern. It is my supposition that these were made for sale to tourists, and so attempt to mimic what the Euro-Canadian market expects and desires. There's a story in that. From the 1880s to the 1930s-40s, the Department of Indian Affairs had a policy called the pass system, which required Native people to obtain written permission from the Indian agent whenever they wanted to go off reserve. To cut a long story short, this made it difficult for Indigenous people to make a living. Indigenous handicrafts became a major lifeline for impoverished people. Every family I know on Six Nations has a story about their great-grandparents getting through that era selling beadwork or baskets or baubles to tourists in Niagara. Pre-colonial suit of armor. The mannequin is wearing a suit of leather clothing as a baseline, so I'll only describe the armor components, from the ground up. Greaves. Shin guards of hickory and oak. The pieces have been carefully carved to fit the leg without leaving any significant gaps between slats, and the holes for lacing have been staggered to avoid creating weak spots. Apron. A panel of woven ashwood and bast cordage that reaches from the navel to the knee. It is attached to the breastplate with flexible leathers which allow it to pivot or lift up under the breastplate as you move. Breastplate. 3 panels of woven ash and oak to protect the chest. The breastplate overlaps the apron such that it will distribute a portion of the blow to a larger area. Leather armor. A vest of heavy moosehide to act as padding and as a second line of defense if something gets through the breastplate. Backplate. I could speculate for days on this, but my best idea is that it could have been to protect a second line of less well-equipped fighters. Helmet. Woven slats over a bent wood frame with something else on top. On wooden armor. Whether or not you consider armor clothing, I have elected to include a suit in this display. Prior to contact, Indigenous combatants across the continent made use of body armor made from leather, cotton, or in our case, hardwood. This armor, which the Wendat called agiendal, is made from slats of ashwood, which are bound together with milkweed cords to prevent the wood from splitting when struck. The effect is sort of like a fabric, where the warp threads are small boards. The armor is very protective against arrows and clubs. It's even useful against steel weapons, but it wasn't able to stop musket balls. So when Europeans arrived, people stopped using the armor within a generation or so. We have an account from Samuel de Champlain about a battle against a small army of Mohawks in 1609. I encourage you to look it up later. It's an interesting read. He gives an account of armor and the reaction to the first encounter with muskets. He describes the forces drawing up slowly and gravely in battle line, and the armies approach within 30 paces of each other. Arrows are about to be loosed, and Champlain fires his musket, which he has loaded with multiple balls. 2 of the foremost Mohawk warriors are killed, and a third is mortally wounded. The Mohawk army panics at the sight of their best-equipped men killed despite their armor. They flee, casting aside their now ineffective armor in order to run better. The armor and discipline that Champlain describes aren't very widely known among the general public. A lot of people imagine native warriors going around shirtless and disorderly. Champlain presents something very different to the popular conception. Unfortunately, people abandoned the armor a short time after first contact, so not very many writers had the chance to see it, and wood and cord rot fairly quickly. So there are no archaeological examples either. The only thing we have are a few brief descriptions and the illustration seen to the right. Previously, I used experimental archaeology to create the reconstruction displayed here. Research, build, test, iterate, repeat ad infinitum. I could talk about this subject endlessly, and I have already. Link in the description. On the fur trade and altered economies. In European colonial society back in the day, the best hats were made from beaver fur. It was prized for softness, appearance, and water resistance. Beaver fur has two layers, longer guard hairs and softer underhair. Only the underhair was used for hat making. It was shaved off and used to make felt, which could then be molded into a hat. It took 3 to 10 beavers to make a hat, depending on the size and thickness of the hat and the size and thickness of the beavers in question. This desire for beaver hats quickly led to the extirpation of the beaver from much of Europe, and led many explorers to view the New World with pound and lever signs in their eyes. Many colonial cities were originally founded as sites to export beaver. The European market's desire for beaver fur hats had a profound impact on all elements of indigenous life through the shifting of economic incentives. One example was how it killed indigenous pottery as art and industry. If a large copper pot is worth 1 beaver skin, and a beaver skin is less effort to acquire than the effort of making a pot, any sensible individual would conclude that pottery isn't worth doing. And so art is sacrificed at the altar of Mammon. So it goes. Several Hudson Bay Company documents are provided here. On the far left is a list of furs that were shipped from York Factory. The other two are standards of trade, price lists showing what a beaver was worth in practical terms, one modified for readability. These are from northern Ontario in the mid-1700s, and so aren't a great resource for our time and period, but they can give an impression of what beaver fur was worth under good conditions. Unfortunately, most of the relevant traders to our region and period weren't big on documentation. We can see an example of shifting economic incentives here. On the rightmost list, it states that 2 trade shirts could be purchased for 1 good quality beaver pelt, and on the left-hand ledger that 2 deerskins were worth 1 beaver. From my own experience, I can say that it takes 3 deerskins to make a leather shirt, so in this economic environment it's not really viable to make shirts of leather. On beaver furring. The desire for beaver pelts quickly led to the extirpation, local extinction, of the beaver in any region the traders touched. The amount of beavers exported was literally apocalyptic. The Hudson Bay report on the far left indicates that York Factory alone shipped over 15,000 beaver skins in 1714. Beavers are an ecologically fragile species. Their practice of building houses in the middle of ponds provides them with good protection from most predators. As such, they have a slow birth rate, a slow recovery time, and a fairly low capacity for being hunted. The beaver lodges also make them vulnerable to humans. People imagine beaver furriers placing nasty-looking traps, and while that was often so, the furriers would sometimes simply wait until winter when the ponds have frozen and the beavers aren't very active, when the furs are the thickest, then surround the lodge and any escape holes in the ice, start tearing apart the lodge and hit them over the head when they try to escape. This allowed people to catch beavers very quickly. After a couple of decades of heavy involvement in the fur trade, the local material culture would change, and people would become dependent on European goods, forgetting how to make things like pottery. This caused problems when the beaver population collapsed, pushing hunters further abroad and causing conflict with other indigenous nations. A period called the Beaver Wars is a tangent beyond the scope of this exhibit. Corn husk dolls. Traditional dolls are made from corn husk, folded, sewn, and tied together. They typically have real hair attached that the maker saved from a recent haircut. They also typically don't have faces, so they can portray a broader range of emotion in a kid's game rather than being stuck happy all the time regardless of scenario like a little Lego man. Kid: "Oh no, the bear is coming! What will we do, Lego man?" But beyond being just another toy, corn husk dolls were also an educational tool to teach children how to sew and pattern clothing that's actually usable, more broadly to get them interested in fashion and in making things. "Mother, Yayat Junie wants a new dress." "Well, here's my sewing kit and a basket of leather scraps. Let's see what we can make for her." get a kid interested, teach them the basics yourself, and then let them try it on their own. Give them the tools and resources they need to experiment so that education becomes another game rather than a chore. You develop a love of the craft and pursue it from the joy of the activity as opposed to mere necessity. Let them play and figure things out in a space where failure doesn't cost any significant material. How clothes were made. Clothing was made almost exclusively from leather. Corn husk bark and milkweed made up some small part, but those were marginal, so we're only going to talk about leather. First, the clothing was measured and the patterns drawn out. This was done mainly by draping the leather over the body, pinning and marking with charcoal. For more complicated sections, one would use a cord as a tape measure to transfer from the body to the leather. These wouldn't be marked with inches, instead one would use a benchmark in the vicinity of what was needed and then count thumb widths from there. Once the leather was patterned, it was cut out. A chert, flint, or copper knife could be used, but more commonly one would use flint chert flakes left over from manufacturing other tools. As a waste product, these would be disposable, so you could always be sure to have one at maximum sharpness, sort of like the original box cutter. Before one could sew, one had to punch holes through the leather. Leather is tough, and even modern steel needles aren't sharp enough to go through easily, much less so the pre-contact needles of bone, antler, and copper. So an awl was used to pre-make the holes before sewing. This would either be a piece of bone, antler, or copper fitted to a handle to allow you to exert the necessary pressure. Leather clothes could be sewn together a couple of ways. Lower grade clothing was sewn using leather thong, either a single long strip or sometimes many small strips of leather, each forming a single stitch, knotted with the many ends left to hang like a fringe. This technique is quick, and the leather thonging can be easily made from slicing up the scraps left over from the cutting of clothes. Higher grade clothing was sewn using sinew thread, which would give you much neater and tighter seams, but would take a bit more effort. Sinew thread was made by drying out a deer tendon or similar, then pounding it flat with a hammer until the individual fibers separate, then pulling it into strings and sometimes spinning it into cord. Iron needles are considerably better than anything prior and were highly prized. They are an example of European technology that traveled faster than the Europeans, being traded through pre-colonial trade routes. How clothes were decorated. They have only a small supply of clothing, but they put infinite time on it, and it occupies them as much as it does European ladies. Joseph Lafitau. We should hopefully all be familiar to some degree with indigenous beadwork. This is obviously a relatively new thing. It wasn't really possible to make beads that small back in the olden days, so clothing was decorated a little bit differently. The prized decoration was quill work. Porcupine quills were dyed in different colors, red and black being the most common. They were then sewn, plaited, and otherwise affixed to the leather to create patterns, often over seams or along hems. These patches of decoration often had a longer lifespan than the clothing they inhabited, being detached and sewn to new clothes when the old wore out. After all, it would have been a shame to throw out the highest effort part just because the soles have some holes. They put on their robes bands of porcupine quills, which they dye a very fine scarlet color. They value these bands very highly and detach them so that they may serve for other robes when they wish to make a change. Samuel de Champlain. As time went by, European bead-making got finer, more industrialized, mechanized. The little seed beads became very cheap, and beading started to take the place of quill work. It's easier to buy beads in bulk than to find and dye quills. Quill work is a little rare now, but beading is still very common in moccasins, earrings, and jewelry. Clothing could also be decorated with paint, typically in fine geometric patterns. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, no examples of this have survived from Iroquois. We only have a few brief descriptions that we can compare against examples from other cultures who held on to the tradition longer. Look up Innu coats when you get home. Very pretty. Paint was made from hide glue and pigment, such as ochre, with a bit of animal fat mixed in. The fat would make the glue more flexible to prevent cracking and help it hold up better to water. Another style of decoration seems to have been the inverse of painting. The trimmings for decorating their garments are made of glue and the scrapings of before-mentioned skins, of which they make bands in various styles according to their fancy, putting in places bands of red and brown color amid those of the glue, which always keep a whitish appearance, not losing at all their shape however dirty they may get. Samuel de Champlain. As I read it, Champlain describes that unpigmented glue would be used to draw a pattern on the leather, then once it had dried, the leather around would be stained with ochre. The transparent glue would be impermeable to the stains and would maintain its white color. It reminds me of metal etching. Decorative painting of clothing died out as cloth became more common. Embroidery took its place, which needs no explanation. My impression from pottery, carved decorative combs, and illustrations is that the earlier fashion for decoration was for designs to be angular and geometric, whereas more natural designs became popular in the 1700s. Trade silver. Metalwork was valued not only for its utility but also for its beauty and the difficulty of obtaining it. In the early days, silver goods were uncommon. While silver sells for a lot, it also represents a higher financial investment for the trader. Many weren't inclined towards the risk. Copper, brass, and iron were the common trade metals of the 1600s. Silver had a sort of rarity. In the latter 1700s, traders started bringing in silver with greater frequency. A high value-to-size ratio makes a certain logistical sense. By this point, silver had acquired a certain prestige. Common objects of trade silver were earrings, gorgets, sleeve garters, and most of all, brooches. Brooches were used not merely for pinning cloaks, but also often just as decoration, often pinned in places where they served no practical function, just to provide a bit of shine. Europeans did not have a total monopoly of metalworking for long. There was already a local tradition of copper working. Bits of naturally usable copper can sometimes be found around the Great Lakes, so it was easy enough to adapt those older cold forging techniques to scrap from broken pots. Some Haudenosaunee communities would also send young men to apprentice under blacksmiths in colonial towns to bring the skill back and reduce their dependence on trade. By the late 1600s, many villages would have an under-equipped blacksmith for making general tools. Silversmithing took longer to establish due to the unavailability of the material, but one common source of silver was coins, which could be hollowed out to make brooches. In this portrait of John Norton, he has so many silver brooches pinned to his shirt that it looks like he's wearing chainmail. Gorgets. Gorget, French word so soft T, gorget, can refer to two types of ornament, one of First Nations origin, the other European. The European gorget began its life as a piece of armour to protect the neck. As muskets became more common, the European man-at-arms gradually discarded various bits and pieces of his plate armour, as it was inconvenient to make them thick enough to protect against musket balls. The gorget was one of the last pieces to go, mostly used by officers to give the most important person a little extra protection from swords and to act as an identifying symbol of an officer, with bright metal shining at the neck. As time went on, its utility as armor faded further, changing into this vestigial version of itself, worn low, too small for the neck, uselessly shaped, and often made from thin brass or silver, and was incapable of stopping even a sword or arrow. The indigenous gorget has a different origin. It was never intended as armor, but instead as a large pendant of shell or stone or sometimes antler, sometimes intricately carved, sometimes plain discs. These might be used as the central bead on a necklace, or be sewn onto a leather band or choker. They were fairly popular ornaments and turn up in archaeological digs with some frequency. Indigenous people identified these European vestigial gorgets as being of a similar character to their own shell gorgets, and due to their use by European officers, associated the silver gorget with status and sophistication, adopting them into their own fashion from time to time. Winter wear. This would all be worn over the other clothes in the exhibit. Winter clothes don't seem to have changed all that much with contact. Cloth has its advantages, but not much is warmer than furs, and nothing blocks wind quite as well as leather. Men's and women's winter wear would look more or less the same. Moccasins. These are a pair of high moccasins, not the right style of construction for our period, a little too modern, but they should give a decent impression. Coat. Heavy leather to stop the wind with rabbit fur trim to help proof it against drafts. The toggles might not be accurate for the 1600s, I'm not sure. Ties might be better, but what have you. Mittens. Bear fur backing for weatherproofing, tough moosehide palm with soft rabbit fur as liner and trim. Hat. This is what an indigenous beaver hat would look like. It has a deerskin shell and a beaver liner, trim, and ear flaps. This is a much more efficient use of beaver than European felt hats. I only needed one fur to make this compared to the 3 to 6 it would take to make a top hat. I bet this is also warmer. Venetian glass. These beads are a reproduction of a type of trade bead called chevron or star beads. The originals were manufactured in Venice, Italy, and were made by pressing the hot glass into a star-shaped form, then adding additional layers of multicolored glass. Finally, the edges were ground away to reveal the pattern. These were a popular trade good globally. People were enamored of the bright colors and complex patterns. They often turn up in archaeological digs as glass holds up well in the ground. Some have even been found in nearby Ontario sites that predate the French colonies, indicating that these were traded by First Nations people all the way up the St. Lawrence from people on the coast who presumably bought the beads from Basque whalers. Up until the modern era, most of these beads were produced in Venice, Italy. It's simply fascinating that we can sometimes tell exactly where a trade item was produced. On wampum. Wampum beads come in 4 types, disc and tube and purple and white for each. Disc beads are a small disc cut from a shell, like a button, while tube beads are longer than they are wide. The purple beads are made from quahog shells, a fairly common species of Atlantic clam which has a purple section near the lip. The white beads can be made from a variety of shells, including the white of quahog shells, but whelk shells were the favored species because they are considerably easier to work with than quahog. The central column lends itself well to the production of tube beads, especially compared to clam shells. The purple beads were twice as valuable as white. Both shells come from the Atlantic Ocean. Local freshwater mussels are too thin to make tube beads from, so people went to great lengths to acquire quahog and whelk. The raw shells weren't particularly valuable before processing, but were traded far inland in great volume. The true value of wampum beads was in the manufacturing. Quahog shells are very brittle. They don't like impact, vibration, or pressure, but they're also very hard and tough, slow to cut, drill, and grind. They are difficult to work with in all aspects and take a bit of practice and skill to make anything without shattering. Disc beads were considerably easier to make, less distance to drill, and were thus considerably less valuable. A decent bead maker could only make about 4 purple tube beads an hour with historical tools, and the process is so temperamental that even modern tools haven't sped things up much. A decent modern bead maker can still only make about 5 or 6 an hour. Because of this, the beads were valued not just for their beauty, but for the effort that goes into them. This made them useful trade goods, high value to bulk ratio, but more than that, they were symbols of effort and commitment. The most notable use of the beads was in wampum belts. Wampum belts are a sort of fabric of tubular shell beads, like a cloth where each weft thread is strung with tube beads in a way that creates a pattern, sort of like pixel art. These belts are famed for their role in treaty making. It's often said that the image links to a metaphor, the dish with one spoon, which acts like documentation. But as there are easier ways to make an image, I think the image is of secondary importance. That it isn't merely a visual representation of the agreement, but it's also a physical proof of commitment. Some belts have over 10,000 beads in them. To me, it's like saying, it took the people of our town 3,000 hours to make the beads for this belt. That's how invested we are in this agreement. Another similar use was as courtship and wedding presents. A young man wants to prove to his sweetheart that he's serious about the relationship, so he spends his free time making beads over a couple of months so that he can give her some jewelry. If the couple were to marry, wampum would take the role of the wedding ring. The man would try to get his family and friends to pitch in and contribute beads to make something special. The end result would symbolize how much the union meant not only to the man but to his family, his friends, and to the whole community. The use in treaty belts overshadows the practical use in the modern consciousness. The treaty belts are important, but it should not be forgotten that the beads were used for all sorts of ornamentation, from bracelets, necklaces, earrings to belts, sashes, and trim. Quotation. They are loaded with quantities of wampum in the shape of necklaces and chains, which they arrange in front of their robes and attach to their waists. They also wear bracelets and earrings. Sometimes they put on plates a foot square covered with wampum, which hang on the back. I can testify that I have seen at dances a girl who had more than 12 pounds of wampum on her person, not including the other bagatelles with which they are loaded and bedecked. Samuel de Champlain describing Wendat girls dressed for a dance. And that's the display. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this interesting. All the best.